Okay, good afternoon, good morning, whatever. So let me just swing right into the panel. The topic here is US-India relations. I think at this point in history, it's a very easy topic. But let me start with just a few comments, and then we'll go down the line and get everybody's inputs. But today, I think both the US and India are facing into enormous opportunities together. That's a positive. And also, there are some challenges that the US and India are facing along with the rest of the world. In some sense, these challenges are bringing the two countries closer together. We see today there's political conflict that has a strong bearing on the world economy. We have at least two conflicts going on that are pretty serious. We see aggressive actions from Russia. We see the rising assertiveness of China. Alongside, we see the fragmentation of global trade, creating stresses on what has been a fairly secular part of globalization. By the way, a little commercial, I've written a book called The Global Trade Paradigm, which goes at length into this topic. We see the advance of technology, most significantly AI, and that was referred to today in a couple of the comments earlier by the ambassador and the consul general, and how, in fact, AI can have huge implications on employment, productivity, and so forth. The advance of AI is creating huge demands on semiconductor capacity, which we're very aware of, sitting as we do in Silicon Valley, and on critical minerals that are needed to support the semiconductor industry. We have issues on climate change and energy security. And to deal with all this, we're seeing some new mechanisms. We're seeing emerging forums, or in fact, what someone called dynamic lattice works, where you have the Quad, 4 countries coming together. You have the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, 14 countries coming together. You have the I2U2, 4 countries in the Middle East, including the US and India. So we've got various mechanisms that are being created because some of the prior mechanisms didn't quite work. And then we see some strong synergies and opportunities that the US and India see jointly in terms of technology, innovation, and global value chains. Finally, both countries are kind of pulled together with a common view or a common, perhaps, distrust of what China wants to do and what are China's goals and what is China's posture. So these are the various things I want to set in terms of context on the US-India situation. And what we have each panelist will focus on a specific part of this. Dinsha will talk about the strategic dimension. I will then pick up on the economic dimension. James will look at the US-India relationship in the context of other dynamics in the world. And MR will focus on the very important people-to-people foundation of the relationship. I'm not going to introduce each one of them because the bio is in the book that you have. So with that, let me turn it over to Dinsha.
Thank you. Thank you for having me as well. It's a great honor to be here, and I've been learning a lot. I usually work on issues related to education, public health, and the like, but occasionally I make the mistake of commenting about strategic affairs.
Hoover conversation with India.
Hoover, yes, the Hoover program in US-India. So I definitely sometimes veer into this lane. I'm going to focus my comments today on just picking up on what Arun said last about this role of an emerging China and how a lot of people say that this should be the basis for a US-India relationship. We've got leaders in the US, in DC talking about how the US-India relationship is going to be the most important in the 21st century because of the threat of China. And I think it's going to be the most important relationship in the 21st century for reasons that have, honestly, very little to do with China. And let me make 3 reasons why I think we should actually think about moving on from this framework of thinking of China as the reason why US and India should connect. So first and foremost, I think that what we see, what the US wants with China, what the concerns are with China, are very different from what India wants and what India's concerns are. India has to be neighbors with China. They're frontline power. The challenges that India faces, we all know them. But at the end of the day, India is going to be there 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, trying to figure out how to make relationship work with China. India's threats are along its border primarily, whereas the US historically has been mostly concerned with Taiwan and the South China Sea. That's a different direction, a different dimension. Obviously, when China does the actions that we see it do, I would personally like to see more collaboration. I certainly think that's an important thing. I think we should be sharing information, talking about China, but basing the relationship on China loses out on a lot of other aspects. So that's the first point. The second point is that just when we take a geostrategic look at the entire region, the region is bigger than China. And I think we would find a lot more convergence, we meaning US, would find a lot more convergence with Indian thinkers when we think about Central Asia, right? When we think about terrorism, when we think about places like Sri Lanka, even when we think about places like the Middle East. I2U2 is a really promising initiative. But there it seems like we've got a lot more to say, a lot more to work with in terms of partnering with India. For instance, right? I think that any kind of policy that the US considers doing now in Central Asia, including in Pakistan, Indians should be at the table talking about it, because I think we have a similar sort of perspective in terms of what we want to see in that region, right? So that's the second point. We can work strategically across a much larger swath than China. Third, I really think that this relationship, it's going to be built on the people-to-people, the economic that you're going to hear. Second largest diaspora in the US right now is Indians, or Indian Americans. One of our fastest growing trade partners, one of our hopes for investment, everything we've been hearing about today, right? The comparisons that we've had with China up until this panel have not been about some kind of potential conflict or anything like that. It's about how India can match China in terms of economic performance, in terms of geostrategic ambition, those sorts of things. Economic performance, these kinds of things are going to really tie in. So I'm much more optimistic about basing a relationship on these areas: energy, health, education, people to people, these kinds of areas. If we focus only on China, say tomorrow something changes with China, right? For instance, say tomorrow, for whatever reason, Xi and the powers that be decide to pull back from the Chinese border. I would hope that India would rush to China with an olive branch, taking up that charge, trying to make peace. If our relationship is based on things like IPEF, Quad, things like that, exclusively checking China, and India suddenly rightly takes an about face, where does that leave these kinds of endeavors? Do we scrap them? Does the US say, okay, we're no longer interested in working with India? That can't be the perspective. We have to take a more grand, broader perspective to the US-India relationship. Now, I think James is going to say why I'm wrong, so we'll have a little bit of a warning tippa. So,
great. Okay, so thank you, Nisha. So your basic point is that don't think that China should be such a dominant influence in a close US-India relationship. And I think most of us would agree with that. I think also current thinking is that nobody wants the world to be two worlds, like a China world and a US world. The US has to work closer with China. There's too much interdependence economically on China. Let me just quickly segue into the kind of the economic aspect of the US-India relationship. I want to say that when I worked in the Department of Commerce many years ago, we felt, and it was our conviction, that economics and commerce have to become central to the US-India relationship. And I was really privileged to work with Amitabh, who was extremely good in helping us come together on that conviction. In fact, at that point, today, a lot of the conversations about strategic and defense, at that point, there was a lot more in proportion about commerce and economics. So where do we stand today? I think the last year has probably been the most productive year in the US-India relationship in probably ever, a very long time. And this is borne out by the numbers, by the volume of trade, although not by bilateral trade and investment treaties between the US and India. By an emerging congruence on national and geo-economic priorities, and as I mentioned earlier, by the US and India participating together in these new lattice works of multilateral agreements. And in some of these, really, the US and India are the central players of those agreements, which is important to remember. In terms of numbers, trade doubled over the last 8 years. Major investments have been made. And the COVID pandemic suddenly made clear that you could work remotely across the world. And that's a huge benefit for India and for US-India companies that work together. As well-known US companies, some of the largest companies have their largest or second largest populations in India. And now technology development and technology corporations are undertaking very serious product development efforts from India. there are apparently 300,000 semiconductor circuit designers working out of India in US and global corporations. So I think the economic relationship is very, very strong. We had some impediments in the past, the issues like ease of doing business, which still exists quite a bit, but there's a lot of progress being made. And we see more consistency in policies. I think the GST that was mentioned earlier today and the bankruptcy code that was mentioned earlier today are great examples of wonderful results that we've seen over the last 10 years. I think we have to also accept that today we're living in a world of global supply chains, and these supply chains are intertwined, and India stands to benefit as the world tries to get redundancy from China. When China, as I said, is 25% of global manufacturing, that is enormous. That's an enormous dependency, and it's often a single point of failure, as we found during the COVID pandemic. So there's definitely a push towards more redundancy, and India stands to benefit from that. I think both the US and India have a great desire to boost manufacturing, to create jobs, to have higher skills, as well as for strategic reasons, not to be over-dependent on other sources. I think, therefore, that the US-India collaboration in manufacturing and supply chain has got to be one of the very big plays for the future. And we're seeing this in semiconductors. For strategic reasons, India has great focus on semiconductors. Today, a number of projects were mentioned, which is great to hear. And I think, and as I see the amount of time I've been spending in India for the last 7 years, the quality of manufacturing capabilities in India has significantly improved. I mean, it's really, I mean, it's, in many areas, it's globally competitive. And you can see that from the fact that India's automobiles, et cetera, compare with the best in the world in their categories. So manufacturing is actually an area of inherent comparative potential capability for India. I'll spend a second on these lattice works. I think the Quad is very important. The IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, that was briefly mentioned in one of the comments earlier, and India is participating in 3 of the 4 pillars of the IPEF to do with supply chain and so forth. That's important, and those kinds of collaborations will benefit the entire region. The India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, the IMEC, that was stood up as a result of the G20, is a major strategic move. And in some sense also counter to the Belt and Road Initiative, although the Belt and Road Initiative seems to be getting a bit long in the tooth. But this could be a very dynamic program, and I think that India is very central to that space as well. Technology was mentioned a few times. More and more we'll see increasing collaboration between India and the US in critical and emerging technologies. I think in the future, conversations and even contentions will be less about trade and more about technology. So it's good to see the US and India coming together under the ICET framework. So where do we go from here over the next several years? The economic dimension, I can only see increasing and intense collaboration between the 2 countries in the public sector and the private sector. As India becomes the 3rd largest economy, it will become an increasingly important market for US companies, providing another incentive. Now, you've got to also put this in a bit of perspective. China was very attractive to the US because also a very large internal market. India is growing today at, let's say, 7% or 7.5%. On a base of about 3.7 trillion. China is, the base of China is almost like 20 trillion. So they have a bigger base, and so it's going to take a while for us to catch up to be equally attractive, but I think we could well be on the right direction. Looking even further, how will the dynamics between the US and India go? I would hope that as India becomes more powerful economically, as China has, we're able to manage between the 2 countries a more comfortable dynamic. I think today we see a lot of conversation between the 2 countries, increasing trust, and I hope that can be maintained even as India becomes more and more powerful economically. So looking forward, I'm an optimist, but history is never a straight line. Things can go wrong, but I think the foundations are in place for the 2 countries to work very well together. With that, let me turn it over to James.
Very good, thank you. So I lived in India for 5 years as a foreign correspondent, writing mostly about business, but for the last 7 years I've lived in Singapore looking at geopolitical developments. Most recently I ran the International Institute for Strategic Studies office in Singapore, which runs the Shangri-La Dialogue Defense Summit, where the United States, China, and India would attend to talk about regional geopolitical issues. And I suppose without, as Dinsha said, without wanting to reprise the debate we had in the previous session between Pranab Bardhan and Sanjeev Sanyal, my aim here, I think, is to disagree with Dinsha and to say that as far as I can see, it would be nice if the US-India relationship was sort of based in this broad-based way with all sorts of different dimensions in it. But it's very difficult to understand what has happened in terms of the way both sides are cooperating without thinking that China is really the motivating force here. I mean, it seems to me that both sides perceive a common threat, albeit realized in different ways. And both sides get sort of common benefits in terms of a much deeper partnership that has changed the way they approach international affairs. I mean, seen from a US point of view, having India in some form as part of a group of countries that are concerned about China's rise, sometimes the like-minded, whatever you want to call it, makes that coalition much more compelling, because otherwise it's simply a coalition of rich industrial countries. And with India there, it's much more diverse. It's also much more geographically broadly spread. And it was for that reason that over a long period of time, I mean, US policy that has been described towards India as a policy of strategic altruism, meaning anything that's good for India is good for the US. As long as India is rising economically, militarily, then that's helpful to US interests, principally but not exclusively, because it helps balance China in Asia. But from India's point of view, I mean, India is relatively weaker than China economically and militarily. It is in the process of catching up on those two metrics, but it's not there yet. And therefore, its only real option internationally is what the international scholars call external balancing, which means being friends with people with whom you can form partnerships. And while the public rhetoric of India's government often talks a lot about an omnidirectional, multi-directional foreign policy, really what has happened over the last decade is that India has vastly improved its relationship with the United States, with the Quad countries, with Japan and Australia and South Korea, and with the Europeans, because those are the countries from whom you get most benefit in terms of technology, defense cooperation. I mean, it's not exclusively those countries. India has built, strategic relationships with the United Arab Emirates or Israel or any number of other countries. But the most important component are those sort of high-tech industrial nations who provide you with a lot of the things that you need when you're trying to cope with a much larger and pretty aggressive neighbor. And so some of the examples that we talked about already, so I set the technology partnership, which has been a very interesting reconfiguration of the US-India relationship around technology. That's not sort of fundamentally about China, but it is a way of building a new form of partnership with sort of China working in the background. I2U2, which you mentioned, the Middle East industrial sort of infrastructure project, I think that's much more directly driven by China, as in I'm pretty sure that at some level, if the United States and the Europeans hadn't sort of developed that partnership with the Middle Eastern countries, then China would have done it instead. And so often there is a sort of direct competitive relationship. So in a sense, I feel like it's okay to admit that China is the sort of part of the motivating factor here. India and the US do not have identical interests. India is principally concerned about South Asia, the Himalayas and the Indian Ocean and China's position there. The United States is principally concerned about East Asia and Taiwan. Ashley Tellis wrote that article that many of you will have read last year saying that the US has made a bad bet on India. He didn't write the headline, but the gist of it was just, we need to be realistic about the fact that the US and India have overlapping interests in some areas, but India isn't going to get involved in a future conflict over Taiwan because it doesn't perceive it to be in its own interest, just in the same way that India didn't join the predominantly Western-led coalition against Russia because it doesn't perceive joining a coalition against Russia to be in its own interests. But at the same time, India, in a sense, I saw the other day an article which said that the India relationship with Russia is in a form of managed decline, as in if you think of India's strategic portfolio of relationships, it has historically been a bit overweight on Russia and is now going to re-rate in favor of other countries, some of which will be Western and some of which will be, like the United Arab Emirates or Israel. And so India is in, as my former boss, John Chipman, used to say, a sort of process of dynamic portfolio management of its international relations. And it has become more overweight on the US, it's becoming a bit more underweight on Russia, and lying behind that realignment, I think, fundamentally, is the concern about China, and we can agree or disagree on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rich. Thank you, James. Emma.
Yeah, I want to focus on the history of the diaspora, where the diaspora has gone, how diaspora can work with India as it gets to 100 years old. So just a quick history on the diaspora. There are about 30 million people who live outside of India, of Indian origin. The first migration happened during colonial rule, when a lot of Indians went as indentured labor to a lot of different countries. That migration stopped when India became independent, and then a new migration started, let's say 30, 40 years ago, when Indians went to study abroad. They went to US and UK and Canada, and now more recently Australia. That set off a complete new trend of migration where people went as qualified, people into geographies where they needed a lot of talent, like the US. And suddenly, the US population of Indian immigrants has grown to almost 5 million now, okay, out of the 30 million. So these are big increases in population to the US, same thing with Canada, same thing with now Australia. Now, almost 3 to 4% of Australia is Indian. Very little known fact. There's 750,000 Indians in Australia, right? So suddenly, a lot of countries are getting a new class of immigrants, highly qualified, highly motivated, and want to generate income, wealth, and they're also tied to India, right? So these are the two different types of diaspora we're dealing with. Is the old diaspora that went as indentured labor, and then the new class of Indians who've gone in as educated people, right? So that's what we're dealing with. Now, as a group together, this 30 million people have helped India tremendously. Last year, it's not gone unnoticed by government officials here in the audience that the diaspora contributed 110 billion, that's B with a billion, of remittances to India last year. And it's only growing every year. These remittances also are changing in terms of demographic. Initially, a lot of money came from the Middle East, where Gulf country workers were sending money. Now that demographic mix has changed to where Western diaspora are investing in India. One of the things that happened recently, I think there was a new apartment complex in Gurgaon that had 1,000 apartments up for sale. I think they closed the deals in 3 days. The fact with that was 25% of those new apartments that ranged from $2 million to $5 million were purchased by the diaspora. So again, the mix is changing in terms of how the diaspora is investing in India, right? So the diaspora can actually contribute both in terms of buying real estate, investing in companies, investing in mutual funds, and so forth, in a very different way than the older diaspora did, okay? So this has to be kept in mind. Now, also, the diaspora is very influential in foreign policy terms, in terms of how it can help India as well, right? There are now 12 prime ministers and presidents of Indian origin in the diaspora, 12. Okay? The prime minister of Portugal, the prime minister of Guyana, the president of Singapore recently was of Indian origin. So again, there's a whole host of people in the political side that have some ties to India that can be helpful. Also in the Fortune 500, in diaspora has produced a list of almost 70 CEOs in the Fortune 500 who are of Indian origin, and most of them are first-generation Indians, okay? So that comes into play as well. And so I think by using this, the diaspora is rising, India is rising at the same time. I think we can help each other grow in stature, grow in influence, and grow in success. So one of the things that the Indian diaspora is also doing in countries where we live is to actually showcase the impact of the diaspora. It's not just generating income or generating wealth, but the soft facts of how the Indian diaspora is helping the countries we live in. For example, in the US, there are about 100,000 Indian doctors, right? Even if you do the math, they serve 10 patients a day. That's millions and millions of patients that are being served by Indian doctors in the US. 7% of the doctors in the US are Indian, right? And this is pretty similar in many other countries Indians live in. Same thing with education. I mean, this is being held at Stanford. We estimate there are between 10 and 20,000 Indian academics in the US. And let's say they teach 100 kids a year. That's millions of students that are being taught by the Indian diaspora. So these are the kinds of things in diaspora is going to be documenting and publishing a report later this year as well, showcasing how the diaspora is also servicing and in the countries we live in. It's not just talking to India, but it's also working with the country we live in. So many, many different things are happening with the diaspora. I think the good thing is the reason the two are growing together, I think we can be helpful to each other. I'll stop with that and come to
Thank you, Amar. No, I think the impact of the diaspora, we're going to see even more. In fact, in China's own progress post their liberalization, the overseas Chinese were a major factor in coming in and investing and helping them grow. I'm sure we're going to see different flavors of that here. In the few minutes we have left, I thought we've got such a great audience. We'd love you to get one or two comments or questions.
The US is going to have an election soon. Can you discuss a little bit, how you think India might feature in that debate and what the consequences of an election result might be for the India-US relationship? Thank you.
That is an interesting question. I think India is much more sanguine about the potential return of President Trump than other Western powers. So I was in Brussels recently, and the just sheer rising panic about this prospect in Europe is palpable. I think in Asia there's more sort of sang-froid about this. I mean, on the one hand, my intuition is, and from talking to people in Delhi around the Prime Minister Modi, they didn't really have all that many problems with President Trump. I mean, they thought they could deal with him, and as I say, coming back to my disagreement with Dinsha, sort of fundamentally, I think because Trump had a quite corrosive, aggressive stance towards China, then many in the Indian security establishment were quite happy about that. They felt he kind of rocked China back on his heels, much more so than President Obama did in the previous administration. I think the risk is that Trump, were he to win, and so I think if Biden wins, then the relationship is on a firm footing and they'll continue and there'll be more development and it'll be reasonably stable and all the rest of it. I think if Trump wins, the risk is that Trump looks at allies and partners and says, well, what are you doing for me? And so he has absolutely no interest in a relationship of strategic altruism, sort of quite the opposite. He's not going to take the attitude of sort of, well, if India is doing well, then that's basically good for us in this amorphous sense. He wants a quid pro quo. And already in Washington, even amongst the kind of the pro-India crowd that Dinsha mentioned, which definitely exists in the Pentagon and the State Department, everyone's very pro-India. They want this relationship to succeed. But there is a sort of underlying concern that sort of we're giving quite a lot to this relationship and we're not getting very much back in return. And that creates a risk, as in they're worried that people in Congress will sort of start saying, well, are we getting enough out of this? Is this enough of a partnership? India is not going to support us in Taiwan when we need it. They didn't support us in Ukraine. So we're doing lots of useful things for India, but what are we getting out of it? And I think on the Democratic side, they say, okay, well, let's look at the bigger picture here. This relationship is very strategically important, and therefore, let's just move forward with it, and good things will follow. I don't think President Trump would take that attitude. I think he would want a more sort of specific quid pro quo, and therefore India probably needs to think about how it would manage that. But I feel like India feels that it would be able to manage that relationship. What do you think, Bensha?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't add much more to what James said. I would mention, however, just in a different dimension, one of the nicest things that we've seen about the election, if we can find anything really heartening about it, we had two candidates on the Republican side that didn't run from their Indian identities at all. Nikki Haley, when her presidential announcement was made, she said she grew up in a town of blacks and whites, and she puts up a picture. I was neither. I was outside, and her turbaned father was there. When she voted in South Carolina the other day, she wheelchaired in her mother. She wasn't running from her identity like we've seen candidates previously. Similarly, Vivek Ramaswamy made the argument that Hinduism links to American values in a beautiful way and talked about his Indian ancestry in a really nice, heartening way. On the Democrat side, you also see people identifying very strongly with their Indian identity. It's a new age for Indians in this country, and it's really heartening to see.
Sriram, and then.
James, you almost did a presumptive close on the upcoming Indian election, which is going to happen much sooner than the American election. So does that have any consequence or change in the way you think about the framing of this?
I'll take this one, at the risk of getting in some trouble. No, I think that, we had Rahul Gandhi here last year, and one of the things that was striking with him was that there really wasn't much daylight difference in terms of foreign policy on any number of issues with the prevailing government. He basically said he agrees with the government on Russia-Ukraine at the time. On China, I think he's following that same path. So in terms of foreign policy, I mean, I think we all know who's most likely to win. It's going to be BJP. But even in some unlikely event that Congress comes in, I think we know what we're going to get on both sides.
Okay.
One thing I want to add, though, is in the Biden administration, there are almost 150 Indian Americans who hold very important positions. That was not true in the Trump administration. So I think that's a factor to be kept in mind.
I think I see Amit. Maybe there's one last point, and then we'll close.
I just wanted to say that I want to speak in between Dinsha and James to pick up on your point about aspirational reframing of the relationship, because I see a very powerful undercurrent that's occurring. Having done civilizational studies for about 30 years, I think India is coming into its own. It's getting very confident, and some of that needs to play into the reframing. I think the question I would ask is, how can, when you said, James, that they're not seeing what India can give to this relationship, I think there is a lot, but it needs that reframing. And I think it's so important to move forward in this relationship.
Out of time.
The United States and India seeing each other as deep civilizations, and what can India bring to the table in this new age of AI with the human values and a lot of fascinating things that it has
Close it
dealt
off.
with.
I mean, I'd say with all due respect, and that's a great topic, but it'll take a long time to deal with, and I see Amit already showing me the...
No, you can just take one more. You have 1 more minute, please.
Go ahead, James.
I think that's an interesting idea. I mean, I think the bigger challenge is that the United States is not a civilizational, doesn't have a civilizational worldview. And in that sense, India has more in common with China. And that's sort of part of the sort of enduring tension that the US liberal internationalism is not really one that deep down India shares. And therefore, that's why I sort of view this as more of a marriage of convenience than a love marriage, if you see what I mean.
I want to add one thing,
Right.
James. I want to add one thing. You said, what is India giving to the U.S.? I think India's export of human capital in the next decade is something the U.S. and other countries will want to have. I call it the geriatric economy that's coming in all the Western countries. They're going to need doctors, nurses, they're going to need staff, and India is going to be able to provide that. I think that's what U.S. is going to get back.
It's surrounded.
All right, I think I'll wrap it up.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'd say, well, thank you. It was a great conversation. Sorry I couldn't take, I think we're really out of time, so thank you. Let's catch up separately with the panelists after this. So thanks again.
Rajat,
Amit.
you have
Thank
a comment or
panelists.
you have a question?
Okay, go ahead. Amit, as long as we have...
Arun Kumar, on how the diaspora has changed, the changing nature of the diaspora. But how do you think the engagement of the diaspora with India has changed over time? Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, I think it's changed for the positive in terms of just the bridges, the number of direct flights from San Francisco to India, the 17 flights a week, right? I mean, things... I think the investments. I think there are tons for diaspora investing in India. That says it all in my mind. Why are they investing in India, not in the US? A lot of capital is going to India from the diaspora. Personal wealth is going to India. So that says it all.
And just on the economic, you covered the economic really well, but politically, it's amazing to me when we get, for instance, a group of generals who come, 20 generals might come from National Defense College. You ask them, how many of you have relatives in the US? Half the hands go up, right? That has some kind of effect because they're observing what's going on in this country. They're getting better understanding of what's going on in this country. There's more communication that's happening from a lower level, person-to-person level that then manifests in really important ways for the relationship.
It's a very good point. Great. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.